Hello and welcome to A Critical Dragon, where I talk about narrative in film, television, and in books. And today I am joined by Carl Albert. Carl, good to see you.
Good to see you too, AP. Happy to be here.
Now, full disclosure for everyone watching, Carl wrote a book, The Truth About Crowns, is not the title.
Rounds, yeah.
And you had actually engaged my services as an editor, which is how I know you.
Yep.
So obviously, but let's talk a little bit about your book, because the subject we're going to move on to is screenplay writing, adaptation, writing for the screen, because that's your day job essentially, although
Right.
currently strike.
Right. Yeah. We're on strike right now. But my training, I went to school for screenwriting, and then hopped right into Hollywood. I live in LA. Uh, I've mostly worked as an assistant so far, but I've made like written a web series and had a variety of different things. I am credited on IMDb, which was kind of surreal when I like looked that up and saw that. But yeah, no, I mean, I know how the industry functions. Still definitely, getting the career going. I mean, not right now with everything on fire. But it's something that I think hopefully we can talk about some things and I can provide some insight into aspects of the entertainment industry that I don't think a lot of people know or think about when it comes to these adaptations. Because certainly I think there's a lot of uh, misguided points of view about exactly what goes on behind the scenes.
And obviously, like, this is really interesting because one of the big complaints that we hear is, oh, it's the writing is bad, and yet we're looking at, you've written a novel, you've written screenplays, you've worked on screenplays and that sort of thing. And sometimes because we're book readers, we assume, and I would suggest incorrectly, but we would assume that writing is writing. Now, if I put it to you as someone who has written both the novel, the Truth About Crowns, and
Go off here briefly.
Truth, Truth of Crowns, which, by the way, fantastic looking book.
Thank you.
But so you've written a novel, you've written screenplays, you've worked on screenplays, you've worked in the industry. Are they the same types of writing?
No, I mean, just fundamentally the format's different. What you're trying to accomplish is different. Um, there is some truth to the idea that like writing is writing in terms of like, you often are developing characters and stories in similar ways, and certainly there's a lot of kind of structural similarities between like say a feature film and how novels are often written, but the actual fundamental, like the words that go on the page and what you're trying to accomplish with them are different. And if anyone's looked at a screenplay, it looks different than a book. It's much more often dialogue driven. Sorry if you hear motorcycles driving by outside. It's, you know, Often it's said that a screenplay is a blueprint for a movie or an episode of TV. And while I think it's a little more complicated than that, and a screenplay is a little more um, that almost removes the artistic element of the screenplay. But I do think there's something to be said for a screenplay is written really to be shot, and not so much to be read. I mean, certainly people will be reading it quite a lot, but it's not like something like a book where you're sitting down and it's just for you and the reader to connect, and where they imagine everything in their head. Like the screenplay, everything has to be literalized and visualized through the medium, and that just fundamentally changes how you approach writing things. Not the least of which is because you have a budget and you have to be in budget, and if you're not, you get in trouble.
Well, I think practical constraints like budget are a big thing, and that impacts costuming, sets, locations, even the length and detail that goes into the finished product. But structural constraints, like the difference between a 25-minute TV show, a half-hour TV show, a 45-minute TV show, an hour-long TV show. Is it actually an hour, or is it an hour long with ad breaks? A
Right.
feature film that 90 minutes or 120 minutes, that these are all structural considerations that have to go into the screenplay. Whereas with a novel, in terms of the speed that you get through it. You go, oh, that novel's 20 hours long on an audiobook. Right. How you actually approach it, like a lot of the writing and how you express things. There are analogs, there are similarities, there are overlaps. But to me, a lot of it is very, very different. Dialogue in a book doesn't necessarily match dialogue in a film.
No.
Because as you point out, like, screenplays are to be performed, they're to be filmed, which means everything in it is performance. And do you remember the first X-Men movie?
Yeah.
Um, Storm, Halle Berry's character, had a line that has been ridiculed.
Yeah.
Which something about what happens to a toad when it's struck by lightning, and then it was the same thing that happens to everyone else. And the thing is, I can imagine that in the script, and it's in the delivery that sells the line. And just that one aspect of her performance, the line fell flat.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's the big difference. Dialogue in films is written for performance with actors and how it is shot, how we see it, how we witness it. Those are all considerations that go into screenplays, that there are analogs in a book because you have your point of view, you have description of what's going on, but so much is left up to the reader to interpret the line.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. No, and I think, I mean, you have the added dimension of in adaptations, you're not writing, for yourself or for, an editor. Like often, I imagine there are cases where somehow the publishing company or an editor gets final say on what exactly goes on a page. But, oftentimes writers are free to ignore their editors if they want to. That is definitely not the case in Hollywood, where, if a producer wants something, or more specifically and more potently, an executive wants something, very often they get it. And certainly you have people like Guillermo del Toro, who famously doesn't take notes anymore. He receives them, he just doesn't read them, he just doesn't care, and more power to him. I love that for him. But the majority of people have to, like, just contractually, they don't have final cut. That's the kind of legal term for it, is you get written in your contract who has final cut, who gets the final choice of the edit. And it's very rare for the writer or a director even to have it, unless they are, a huge big name like Martin Scorsese or something. Like it just fundamentally changes the way you approach, because you're suddenly playing a political game. And I mean, that's so much what people don't see. And that, to a big extent, even people in the industry like myself, like, you have no idea what exactly goes on behind the scenes. I mean, I know, to kind of talk about something maybe even a little more familiar to your audience, the Wheel of Time show. I know Rafe Judkins, the showrunner, mentioned how just for the pilot episode alone, he got like hundreds or like thousands of notes. And even if you couch that with, oh, maybe he's slightly exaggerating, maybe he's speaking hyperbole, I'm sure he got so many notes it would be hard for you to even fathom, and they would all contradict themselves, because they always do. There are so many cooks in the kitchen, and it's a real skill to be able to balance that. And I would say a common rule of thumb is the more money involved in a project, the more or the less control you will have as a writer, and the more you'll have to answer to other people. Like, again, for the Wheel of Time, I know the original plan was for it to be 10 episodes. And the first episode, the pilot, was going to be 2 hours long. It was not that. Amazon said it has to come in under an hour. And so they had to figure out how to make that work. And then they said it's going to be 8 episodes, not 10. And so, that goes to impact how you handle things. And certainly, some people are better at managing that than others. But I think it's something that, for, I think, a lot of viewers, they don't even think about, because they don't know to think about it, that there are these whole additional dynamics where it's not just this like pure unbridled creativity, coming out onto the page, like, ooh, I'm just throwing out words, and this is my process, and we're shooting, whatever comes up. And maybe you think, oh, do they have the budget for this CGI monster? But you don't think about, like, well, what's going on behind the scenes, and like, who are they answering to?
are you suggesting that, there isn't just a giant money spigot that is just pouring money into production, and you're sitting there as a showrunner with your team of writers, and you just go, oh, we just need more money. I'll just turn on the money spigot and we'll just pay for all these things. And they're going to give me all the artistic license that I want. With
Unfortunately, yeah.
Oh, you mean that doesn't happen? Oh, right.
Not as often as I certainly wish it would.
It's fascinating because even when you watch the opening credits of a lot of TV shows, it's like, you get the produced by, in partnership with, and in connection to, and suddenly there are all of these other companies that get added in, and you're like, right. So uh, I've been involved in a couple of things in the past, and in it, you were setting up a team of, you might have your showrunner, and you might have a head writer. If the showrunner was more on the production side, you might have a head writer who reported to the showrunner, or vice versa. That, if you had a writer who was the main showrunner, then you had their sort of right hand would be someone more on the production side. Then you had your writer's room. And then you had, you put together this package of, well, who are the actors? Who are the other things that we're getting involved in? And then that was sold. So you basically set up almost like a production company. That is then sold to one of the big distributors or networks that they're going to provide the money for all of this. But they then have a say in the thing that you're doing because you're
Yep.
not making it for them.
Mm-hmm.
And suddenly you can see all of these different angles where what you want to do is being curtailed by the practicalities of getting something made.
Absolutely. I mean, the additional level beyond even just executives is you have financiers, and often financiers, especially for these big budget movies and shows, will have a say. And these are like Wall Street people, like people completely disconnected from the entertainment industry who will still get a voice, and a fairly powerful one. And I will say, to speak to the showrunner thing, typically it is a writer, but that has been changing in recent years, and is a thing that the Writers Guild has been chafing against, because I mean, particularly like for a really mainstream example, the Marvel shows have been giving really the final creative power to the directors, which is not how TV typically works. I mean, sometimes the showrunner, the writer, is like does direct episodes. Like if you watch the Foundation TV show, David S. Goyer, the showrunner on that, has been directing a number of episodes, but oftentimes they are separate, and they hire directors to come in and work with them, and they still have an impact on things, absolutely, especially about the performance, but it fundamentally changes the approach to story, where now you're becoming more like film, where sometimes I mean, the fundamental truth in Hollywood is that writers really aren't respected. They have a little more respect in TV, but they're really not respected, especially in features. And like, I mean, if you go around, people think like anyone can do it, anyone can write. And I think that's true online too, is you'll have people like, talk crap and, be like, I could have crapped out a screenplay better than this. And it's like, you have no idea what the process is. And that's not to say all writers are created equally. Like certainly some are better or worse than others. That's true in Hollywood as it is anywhere, but it's tough. And you find that in this changing industry landscape, the reason there's a strike going on, that writers are fighting to have the control that, often leads to better shows, because who knows the structure, who knows the characters, who knows, the pacing better than the writers do, right? And it's usually a bad thing when that gets taken away from them.
But and a big part of that, I think, streaming had a huge impact on this, because suddenly, instead of starting out as an assistant writer on a TV show for a network, where you were employed all year, and you'd spend time on set, you'd spend time learning the ropes, you'd learn about a lot of the practicalities of filming and producing a TV show, because everyone was being cycled through all aspects of the production. So a brilliant example I heard once was a writer who had written a scene about the main character, for a joke, falls into a swimming pool. And they were brought down on set, and the director just went, "That's a really bad idea." I said, "Why?" well, now we're going to need to have 7 sets of costumes. And so, because each time they fall in, we're going to reshoot this. And so they have to get out, they have to get dried, they have to have their makeup redone, they have to get back into the costume. And then we're going to shoot it again. And they're going to fall into that pool, depending on the take. It might be 15 takes. And the writer, because this was at the very beginning of the career, went, and that was the last time I ever wrote a gag about falling in a swimming pool.
Yeah, that's one of the practicalities and things you learn is, yeah, there's a lot to learn for young writers, definitely.
You know, there are some amazing things to get around all of this sort of stuff, but it requires knowing the industry, knowing the practicalities of making a show, as well as all of the craft ability to get your vision of the script across, as well as the ability to tell a compelling story. There are so many different elements to it. And
well, I was just going to interject to say, and for people who don't know, one of the big issues that the writers are striking for right now is that traditional kind of ladder, that apprenticeship program in Hollywood has been just gradually chipped away at, and streaming has largely been the reason it's been destroyed. So you don't just start as an assistant or then, a staff writer and rise up the ladder anymore. Like oftentimes, because people are stuck on these short 8-episode orders where they're maybe working for 20 weeks out of a year or less even. And one, they're just like not making a living anymore. But two, studios aren't flying them out to set. So they don't learn those practicalities. They don't learn like you shouldn't write, you should think twice before writing a gag about falling into a pool because we're going to have to, dry them off and redo their makeup and get them a new costume over and over and over again. They're not learning that. They're not learning how to become showrunners. And it's creating this problem that we haven't even really seen the full end results on. Is like, as much as people criticize, modern television writing, which I think is silly because we're in like the golden age of television. Like there's a lot of bad stuff made, but like there's more good stuff made than ever before. And I encourage you that if you think television is terrible right now, like look up, like Google like best shows on TV right now, and you will find so many shows that are fantastic. Like branch outside of like fantasy and sci-fi. And I promise you there's a lot of amazing stuff. Anyway, but beyond that, like young writers aren't learning how to become showrunners. And it's going to be hugely damaging if we don't fix that, because suddenly you're going to have all these people who are just incapable, like they don't know, and then they're honestly probably going to lose more power and it's going to go up to the executives more, and then we're just going to see more crap made, and it's a vicious cycle,
and more giant mechanical spiders being added in.
Exactly.
Insider Hollywood joke there.
Yeah.
But
man.
But this is one of the fascinating things, because even audiences today, and like we hear this, like, fantasy TV or fantasy films just aren't good anymore. Why? What do you think's changed? Have you gone back and looked at what we used to have? As
as opposed to Conan the Barbarian starring the Governator, like really?
Well, that was at least faithful to the. No, it wasn't. It wasn't faithful to the source material. It wasn't tonally faithful. It barely bore any resemblance to the hard Conan stories, or like the BBC adaptation of Merlin. So all of the Arthurian myth, massively popular show. And what source material was it being faithful to? Who cares? We're just going to make stuff up. But it was fine. It was a TV show. And there are so many of these shows where people keep pointing to, well, they're adapting this. They need to be faithful. But no, that's not what adaptation is. Oh no, it should be. And you look at something really, really popular, like The Boys on Amazon at this terrible cut. You can criticize the company all you want, but The Boys on Amazon is an adaptation of comic books. And they race swapped characters, they gender swapped characters, they changed plot points, they changed entire sequences, entire seasons. You sort of go, that wasn't in the comic book at all, anywhere close to the way that it's shown there. And it deviates so wildly from it, but it's a brilliant TV show. It's a really great adaptation because it captures something of the original. And the showrunner on that, Eric Kripke, you go, he's a brilliant writer. He is. Look at his resume on IMDb and you go, Supernatural, The Boys. Oh, I love both of those. Then look at the ones that failed.
Yeah.
Because sometimes things don't connect with an audience. And it doesn't matter if the person is an amazing writer. Sometimes it just doesn't connect. It doesn't strike that cultural spark, that lightning in a bottle that we want. And people, I think, are very, very quick to blame writers for things that you look at and you go, that seems very much like not a writer's issue. That seems more like something happened. Someone had to come in to try and fix something, and this was the closest they could do in the time frame they had.
I to give a specific example of that, I mean, I don't know this for, I do know this for a fact. So I read the Wheel of Time pilot before it came out. I got my hands on it. I just literally was talking to a writer friend who's like much more experienced than I was, and somehow he had it. And we brought up Wheel of Time, and we both read it, and we're fans of the series. And I read it. The original teaser was not what we originally, and teaser meaning like the opening scene, was not what we got at all. You know, we had this, what we actually got was horrible. Was, you know, this weird thing with Moraine, like describing things that we later would find out in the episode for us. That reeks of executive notes. That reeks of, you know, I think they're just not going to understand. Like, it's kind of confusing. You know, can you kind of just have her say it? And, you know, I'm sure there were so many conversations of like, well, no, like I think it lays it out here, 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 and they're like, but can we make it a little clearer? You know, like I just don't know. Like, there are a lot of people who are watching while they're on their phone, which is true, and you know, it led to us getting like what I do think is a horrible opening to a TV show. But that is like no writer planned to have Moraine get dressed and, you know, just look at a map, and while she monologues things that like are just like fundamental and explained later on in the show. So I, you know, I think there's stuff like that where you have no idea, like kind of the conversations that are going on behind the scene and how hard writers are having to fight, you know, to maintain maybe even fidelity, you know, to the source material. I mean, it's so interesting you bring up The Boys, because that is a widely acclaimed show, and one I love, that I think a consistent trend among comic adaptations is that oftentimes I feel like the fans are more open to adaptations as opposed to books. I don't know why that is. I don't know if it's the weird like multiverse comics thing where like fans are used to like things getting rebooted and characters having like new origin stories and different stuff happen to them, or what. I mean, that's just my theory. But like you'll see a book's adapted and it's like suddenly like it has to be 1-to-1, or like if not 1-to-1, like extremely close, and like I want like word to word like the dialogue to be the same and everything. And you won't, you know, I do think often fidelity to the source material, especially the spirit of the source material, is important. But you know, you have things like The Shining where there's a lot kind of on paper that is similar in terms of the general story, but like fundamentally the tone and the characters are different, and the movie says something very different than the book. And I'm a huge fan of both. I actually watched the movie before I read the book. I was just getting into Stephen King then, and I think he, you know, he famously hates the movie, and I understand as the author like why it may frustrate him that like Jack Torrance was, you know, watered down into this much more simplistic, you know, evil character, almost pre-corrupted, as opposed to like the really tragic protagonist that he is in the novel. And at the same time, you know, it makes for a really good scary movie that now we look at and is often people's like, that's the best horror movie of all time. And so it definitely goes to show, you know, one, that just like fundamentally different mediums often lead to different outcomes, or, you know, require different approaches. But also just, you know, fidelity doesn't necessarily equal quality per se.
You know, I think the Witcher is a great example of this, because when we talk about, say, like the Witcher fans, and you go, well, are you a fan of Witcher 3, the computer game? Oh yeah, I love that. And you go, despite the fact that it is utterly unfaithful in so many regards to Geralt's character. Well, why would that be? Because it was giving the player freedom to make the decisions. So Geralt's character is changed because the player gets to decide it, and it disregards the lore. Well, what do you mean? Well, there aren't meant to be that many monsters left. That's why Geralt and all the other Witchers are kind of a dying breed, because they're poor all the time. and they whine all the time about being poor. And yet in the game, you can't walk 50 feet without stumbling over a new monster nest. And that's
Right.
because, well, yeah, that's what you do in the game. That's what the game is doing. And it changes what decoctions are, and there are different effects. It changes how the signs function, all because of mechanics. It plays around with a lot of the characters, and it references
In a big way. Yeah.
it references a lot of stuff from the book series by Sapkowski. But at the end of the day, it's quite a different beast. It's an adaptation, and it's
Right.
changing for the medium. It's changing it to provide a completely different ludic mechanic to all of these things, and we can really, really enjoy that. And if you enjoy the sort of the episodic nature of monster hunting that's in Witcher 3, which most people haven't played Witchers 1 and 2, and I've
Right.
played through them all. I quite enjoyed it. But you might really enjoy the first two books translated into English for The Witcher, which are all short stories. And there's more of a focus on monster hunting. But the rest of the books, the novels, are actually quite different. Where, Geralt's character, he whines a lot more. He's much more loquacious. He's always poor and complaining about being poor. Ciri becomes more and more important. And I think depending on where we fall, you can be a fan of all of the different types, but your perception of who Geralt is, what the world is, your expectations about the world, your expectations about the type of story that's being told can be radically different depending on how you encounter the Witcher world and stories and characters. So how do you translate the books onto the screen? And Witcher season 1 used multiple time frames, jumped around in time, just like the short stories did.
Yeah.
You go, and if Yennefer is going to be really important, right, give her a backstory, identify her as one of the main characters instead of the rather nebulous and short shrift that she gets in the actual books. So that has to be built in. And if Ciri is going to end up being an incredibly important character, introduce her early on, because that's where the series is going, because that's where the books go. That you can see all of these decisions. There's a clear rationale for it that understands the material, that understands the material in a holistic sense. This is where the series goes. This is what's focused on. These are the things that we want to do. And what can we take from that and put into the show? Because the show has a limited number of episodes, limited runtime. And people say, oh, well, just do a monster hunting show, the sort of monster of the week. Well, that's not true to the novels. So do we just disregard the novels and do a monster of the week show? Oh, well, that would have been so much cooler. Would have been really cool for a lot of the players of the computer game. But if you were fans of the novels, well, that's disappointing because you're not getting the stuff about Ciri as much. You're not getting the building out of the world and the politics. That is all part of the novels. Where do you draw the line? And the thing is, writers have to make decisions.
Right.
And no writer is ever going to make a decision that every single person is going to agree with.
Yeah, well, that's definitely true. I mean, Witcher is such an interesting case study in all of this and talking about adaptations. Like, it's a show that I confess I've soured on a bit. Like, I don't know. A lot of I just feel like it's really inconsistent. Like, I feel like it has some really good episodes, thinking of the latest season, and then some really bad ones. But you go back to season 1, which I do think is probably, in my opinion, the strongest season. And if only, because maybe of its new, fresh factor. The most widely criticized aspect of that season, other than maybe some shoddy CGI, was the multiple timelines. People are like, it's confusing. It doesn't make any sense. I can tell you, one, I know people who followed it who had no experience with the books. So it's definitely possible. But two, like, yeah, it's true to the source material. And if anything, we've had shows like Westworld, that have done that before. And so now you have, then articles come out where it's like, oh, people involved with The Witcher were like, well, we had to simplify the story for, American teenagers or whatever, which, like, I agree. Like, why are you saying the quiet part out loud? Like, come on, it's just like not.
But if the big complaint about season 1 was this is confusing,
yeah.
and you go, Right. So we were given notes that we had to simplify this. And like remember,
Exactly.
a lot of readers of fantasy series understand narrative quite a lot better than a lot of people who just watch TV. It's not true in all cases, but
Right.
it's certainly the perception. And for someone who comes from outside of America, sometimes when you look at stuff that's produced in America, the American version of stories from elsewhere, you go, right, that's been dumbed down. Why would
Yep.
that be? And it's not because the writers themselves think that American audiences are stupid. But as you pointed out at the beginning, it's not always the writer making this decision. It could be an executive who thinks that the average viewer is stupid and therefore is insisting that things be dumbed down.
95% of the time, that's exactly what it is it's someone who has the money, who holds the purse strings, who's telling you, no, 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 people aren't smart enough for this. You have to simplify this. You have to dumb it down. And it's I mean, I think there's something to be said that obviously there are times where viewers seem dumb, but at the same time, I think generally they're smarter than people give them credit for. Even American viewers, believe it or not, I think can handle more than a lot of people give them credit for. But it's a complicated issue, and again, it just fundamentally stems down to the Hollywood politics of it all. Is that you have to contend with many masters. And yeah, I mean, talking about The Witcher, the video game is so fundamentally different in so many ways. Like the big bad guy, Amir of the whole story, he wants to have sex with Ciri and marry Ciri in the books. It's like a huge part of his storyline. That's not a thing in the game. Geralt, likewise, yeah, comes out fundamentally differently. His personality is much more, the early season Henry Cavill, like cursing and going around and just grunting at everything. And like, as opposed to like in the books where he soliloquies all the time about how poor he is and how sad he is and how he doesn't want to be involved with anything. And it's all about the lesser of two evils and blah, blah, blah. And like, and that's something that they added a little more in the later seasons. But my big criticism of the switching timelines, sorry, veering back to this, because this is something that only occurred to me recently, was that Yaskier does not age. Like you can kind of like, he doesn't even get a haircut. And like, it's like 10 plus years or like 14, 15 years, and he looks the exact same. You're like, you look at The Witcher and you're like, yeah, like he doesn't age. He has weird like alchemy going on inside him. Like, okay, the sorceresses, yeah, sure, they don't age. Like that's their thing. They have these illusions to make themselves look young. But Yaskier the Bard is like, he is just, his skin is perfect. He's glowing, he's waltzing around. Like he has the same Bieber bangs throughout the whole season. Like I look back at that, I'm like, it's silly. It's just silly. And that maybe would have been one little detail they could have made to like lean into, oh, these are different timelines, to kind of alert things.
But in that first season, almost every single time there was a time jump until it was established that this was a different time period, there were blatant signals in dialogue. So
Yes.
it's like Calanthe going, "Oh, these people are arriving to fight us," and then the next scene it was, "Do you remember when the Lion of Sintra fought them off?" You go, "Right, this is after that thing because that scene was before. This scene is clearly years afterwards," and
Yeah.
it was in like so many of the time jumps, and I just was going like it was a really clever way to do it because it was unobtrusive instead
I
of
thought that too. Yeah.
putting the big thing up on screen going, Sintra, 22 years later, as if we didn't pick up on that. And then it turned out a lot of people didn't pick up on it. And you go, right, that's why you get these really obtrusive things dumped into TV shows.
I can tell you I had notes on a script exactly to that effect, where it was a multiple timelines thing. And it actually hinged on, it was a TV pilot. And at the end of the episode, you have this reveal that like there've been very clear hints, including like it was a haunted house show and like, oh, the house is abandoned here. The main storyline is people living in the house. And so at the end, it's made very clear that there are two timelines going on, and one of the characters you see in one of the timelines is the older version of the main character in the younger timeline. And a note I got was like, this is confusing. I don't know what's going on. you know, like flag it more. And so I did the, the classic Hollywood thing of like, I think I used like then and now as opposed to like a specific age time, because I kind of like
Yeah.
playing with the, the mystique of it and keeping it vague. But you get those notes. Like that's a perfect case study. And I'm right there with you. I thought it was really cleverly done. I mean, I was actively paying attention. I was so excited for Witcher because like that was our first big not Harry Potter show, first big fantasy show after Game of Thrones. And so I was, I'm a big fantasy
Uh,
nerd.
well, what about Cursed, the Frank Miller adaptation? Oh,
I
you
didn't
didn't
watch
see it.
it. I
Then there
confess.
was there was an Arthur adaptation as well, which was trying to be Game of Thrones because it was all about violence and sex. Because obviously the people making it went, we want to be like Game of Thrones, but took the wrong things from it.
Which are you talking about? Was this a show or a movie?
No, both
Was this
shows.
the movie?
No,
Okay.
these
The
were
movie
both
or
TV
the show I
shows.
did. Okay. The Cursed I was aware of. I did not watch. The Arthur one I've not seen. I also say the Guy Ritchie movie is fun. Nothing like this, the myths, but I think it's just fun. Like you sit back, it's silly. Arthur really loves his like prostitute pseudo moms. I love it. Charlie Hunnam is a delight. Oh, anyway, that's my hot take for the day. It's a stupid movie that I think is a lot of fun.
Yeah, and that's it. When you think like all of the Robin Hood movies and Robin Hood adaptations that we've had, someone mentioned in my or had commented on a video the other day, and I went to IMDb and just took the last like 30 years to list out all of the Robin Hood adaptations, and it's more than one every 5 years.
Yeah.
You, that's a
Crazy is
fair
they never make,
number.
yeah, they never make money too, and they're always critically panned. It's like that's one of those remarkable areas where like Hollywood just keeps going up to bat and like no one turns out for it. And that's another one where I feel like some of those movies are definitely better than others. Like, but yeah, that's weird.
Well, Robin Hood, Prince of Thieves with Kevin Costner, and Robin Hood Men in Tights. Two really good Robin Hood movies, very, very different.
Very
And
different.
do either one of them really respect the source material or the historical period? Nah. But they were fun adaptations of the Robin Hood story. Um, I mean, I saw the recent thing about the announcement that Disney made about the live remake of Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs,
Right.
and there were a bunch of people complaining, this is a disgrace. It's changing the source material. You go, right, go and talk to a folklorist about what Disney has done to fairy tales,
Right.
because the Disneyfication has become a term for what
Right.
happens to fairy tales when they go into the House of Mouse. Like, oh, but the original Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs was amazing. You're like, yeah, but you do realize it took massive liberties with the Hans Christian Andersen version or the Brothers Grimm version or whatever version they ripped off, chewed up, and spat out as that animated show or that animated feature. And the thing is, it is a great feature. We don't get upset when people make changes, but apparently, fidelity to text, to the most inconsequential things in text, is this shibboleth now in a lot of fan discussions. And like, I remember one of the criticisms of Rings of Power, and it's fine not to like it. I thought it was entertaining, but they were going, oh, but there's only these three ships. Terrible writing. That's not a writing decision. That's a CGI decision. Because the CGI, like, do you think they went and built three ships? No, that was an instruction to the CGI team. And or one of the scenes where Elrond and Celebrimbor turn up at Moria, or what becomes Moria, uh, and they go, "Oh, there was no transition. It just looks like they teleported there." You go, "That's not a writing thing. That's a scene editing thing where you needed a couple of seconds of them tying up their horses or putting their packs down to walk up to the door. It needed something just a couple of seconds earlier to show that, yes, they didn't just teleport from the workroom to the doors in the same outfit. But that's a costuming, editing, and directing thing. It's not necessarily anything to do with writing.
I will say the showrunners probably had some level of approval on that. Although who knows, it could have been based off some, you know, we need this to be shorter. So find out wherever you can trim however much from the episode as you can. Like, it is remarkable how much that happens. Is they'll like, again, like the Wheel of Time pilot, where they're like, it has to be under 60 minutes. So you cut everywhere you can. If you can trim a few seconds somewhere that you think people will intuit it, and I bet that was a similar scenario where they're like, well, we could probably cut this down. Like, this is already an hour and a half long. Like, just trim these like 10 seconds, and it
Because
leads to visual confusion.
and that we have that in film all the time, where someone wakes up and slaps the alarm, and then they're sitting in their office,
Right.
because we just remove that transition, and yet it's implied. And when it happened in Rings of Power, people were like, oh well, they just teleported there. You're like, well, did they? But it wasn't signaled enough to viewers that the distance that was traveled. And compression and movement in fantasy worlds is always a bit weird.
It's always a problem. Every fantasy story, like Game of Thrones was one that both as a show and like the Song of Ice and Fire book series has moments, or is like, it was famed for a long time for like taking travel seriously. Same thing with Lord of the Rings. And if you like actually like really dig into the details, like the mileage of everything varies. Like in the books, like there are clearly moments where George R. R. Martin is like changing his mind in the moment, and like what features are around in certain areas, and like it just happens. Like, he's not keeping track of that as well as a fan who is like analyzing and like looking for a reason to be mad is. So it's just something that I think that you can certainly, it's valid to criticize it, but it's worthwhile to acknowledge that not everyone is concerned about that.
And again, it always comes down to where the dividing line is for our own personal willing suspension of disbelief. And it's, like with Rings of Power, this is the same world where Elrond's dad gets in a ship, sails into space, and becomes a star.
Right.
Right. And the world was flat. Right. Okay. Fair enough. And there are vampires and werewolves.
True.
But if you threw all of that stuff into the show, it would feel kind of weird. Like suddenly, oh, it's a flat Earth. But in Lord of the Rings, in the Third Age, it's definitely a globe. So, and that's because it was never fully fleshed out. There were a whole load of bits where the Legendarium does not neatly fit together. And that's fine. It doesn't have to. But we have this very strange thing now because of, in fantasy particularly, the development of secondary worlds as real settings.
Right.
That's created an expectation, but that's not what Tolkien wrote. So do we try to cater to modern audience expectations, or do we try stay true to what Tolkien wrote?
Well, and I think it's, worth adding, we're talking about Tolkien, that like, I mean, the Silmarillion is its own can of worms, because Tolkien didn't even write. I mean, his writings are in it, but his son put it together with Guy Gavriel Kay's help. But even with the stuff that he wrote and had published and like had his approval on, the Lord of the Rings and the Hobbit, he changed the Hobbit to fit with the Lord of the Rings. So even he, in the moment, in his like iconic finalized published works, hadn't finalized them. I mean, he ultimately did have a version that he like let out, but like he was still open to changes. And so I definitely think that's something that often gets lost, that people forget. Even the artists will change their minds, and you can criticize, certainly, are the changes for better or worse, but it's our art is often a fluid thing, and stories certainly they change with the telling.
And how many times has George Lucas tweaked Star Wars?
Yes.
Multiple versions of scripts, and then here's the cinematic release, here's the director's cut, here's the new edition that we've now changed a bunch of these. Well, actually, that didn't work out the way that I want, so going back in and I've re-CGI'd things. Right. So what's true to Star Wars? And
right.
For a lot of properties and stories that we care passionately about, we have our own internal vision of, and the things that we treasure about it, the moments that we treasure about it. And it is absolutely natural when you're watching an adaptation to go, well, I'm disappointed. They didn't do the thing that I wanted. But books are written for an audience, TV shows are produced for a different audience. And one of the very common things that we used to see all the time in adaptation for TV of established works was, yeah, here's the TV adaptation, but for the fans of the books, here's an Easter egg. Because we love this stuff. The reason we are dedicating X number of years of our lives to making this TV show is we really enjoy it. And we want to show the fans that we are aware of, yes, this stuff from the book. So we've thrown it in as an Easter egg because we still have to make a TV show for a general audience. And fantasy and science fiction are niche audiences.
Yeah.
And it's always trying to strike a balance. But yeah, I don't think I have ever met a single writer involved in a project like this. And I've met a few who's been, yeah, the source material is absolutely awful. And so I'm going to spend the next 4 years working on it.
Yeah, exactly. Right.
Because everyone I have ever spoken to, I was like, oh, this was, oh, that scene, oh, couldn't stand that scene. That was terrible. The same way that we all do with every book that we love. Is like, oh, don't like that bit. But this was amazing. And they're excited about it. And they're excited about the ability to try and translate it and bring it to a big audience. So then that big audience can go back to the original works. And it's like, you think our TV show is great. It is. We love our TV show. But go and read the originals that inspired us to make this.
Right. That's one of the things that personally makes me the angriest and the most just like generally frustrated is when I see people online not having issues. Like you can always criticize something, but being like, well, the people involved hate the source material. And I know some stuff came out The Witcher, like one of the writers was like, there were people making fun of the source material and what like who knows what is going on there, but I certainly think the showrunners, of these book series have expressed nothing but love. And I mean, particularly when you talk of like Rings of Power and Wheel of Time, these are showrunners who repeatedly over and over have talked about how they've read these books since they were kids, how these mean a lot to them. And like, you don't have to like the adaptations, but to pretend like they don't care or that they don't know what they're talking about or like haven't read the books, is just ludicrous and is just wrong. It's just incorrect.
I know, but Carl, clearly they're just lying.
Right.
Because, if I don't like it and I'm a fan and they say that they're a fan, then clearly they're lying. Like that's the logic.
Right.
Like,
and clearly all fans agree on all, the same things. And no fans ever fight and disagree about certain characters and interpretations. That never happens.
But it's Viggo Mortensen, absolutely brilliant Aragorn. Like everyone loves Viggo Mortensen as Aragorn. Why does he have a beard?
Because he looks
shouldn't have a beard. How dare Peter Jackson disrespect Tolkien's work and have facial hair on a character that can't have facial hair?
Yep. And who should be like 7 feet tall, by the way.
And it's when you hear these things and you go, double standard, maybe? Yeah. And it's fine not to like something, but to imply that it has to do with the intentionality, that they are deliberately disrespecting because they made changes. Oh, they think they're better writers. It's right. Tolkien had to be forced to make the paperback editions of The Lord of the Rings because he thought that they were cheap and horrible, and he was not a fan of paperbacks. Can you imagine how good a TV writer Tolkien would have been?
Not good.
Because his style of writing absolutely lends itself to writing a TV script. I can't see any problems with Tolkien's approach to writing leading to bad TV. It would obviously be amazing.
I think he would have just fundamentally hated, like, just his personality. He would have hated the industry too. He would have like burned it down on his way out. Well,
Tolkien, very famous, to paraphrase him, was basically, if people are going to change it, they have to pay me for the privilege. That was Tolkien's attitude. I think
fair enough.
When we talk about the Tolkien estate, who have so fiercely guarded a lot of Tolkien's legacy, and now it's, oh, well, they're just in it for the money. But you weren't saying that when Christopher Tolkien and the Tolkien estate were quite critical of Peter Jackson's films, because they're now beloved.
Mhm.
But they were Christopher Tolkien was quite explicit in his criticism of Peter Jackson's adaptation. And you go, right, so why is it now suddenly when the Tolkien estate and family are fine with it, that it's a problem? It's everything gets muddled up, and I think a lot of issues with a number of these TV shows are being attributed to writers and writer intentionality, when there are far more uh, readily believable areas where you go, yeah, so it could be it worked on the page, it didn't work on the screen. That happens. It could be they had written a perfect script and were told, okay, your script's running for the whole season, total 12 hours, you have to do it in 8. Find 4 hours to trim.
Yeah.
Some of it, I think, can be laid at the feet of, we want to do this thing and we're going to do this thing, and it's spinning out of control. I think Rings of Power, to me, there are fundamental decisions they made with the writing and direction and what they were doing that I disagree with. But I think one of the big problems with it is, in trying to tell a singular story, they were jamming in too many different story threads and a mystery box. But a lot of that is my dislike of mystery box storytelling and the structural stuff that's going on. But again, it's only season 1. And if this was sort of plotted out over what they're going to do for each of the different seasons, so they have a general arc that they're following, it might be really interesting to see where it goes. But again, we don't know the behind the scenes stuff. And certainly it's not because of a lack of love for the source material, lack of ability, studio interference, the pandemic. There are all sorts of reasons why things went wrong. CGI instructions and things having to be done quickly. Like, we know that a lot of the animators in Hollywood are grossly overworked and grossly underpaid.
Yeah.
Particularly with a lot of the Marvel shows taking up a lot of the time that all these different studios had.
Right.
That suddenly they're doing Marvel projects, and therefore people are trying to squeeze in other things. And
Absolutely.
as consumers, we only see the end product, and we have to make guesses about what went on. But as you and I both know, people will read your book, and it'll be judged on that, on how they interpret that book. And they won't know what went on in the previous drafts. They won't know what went on in conversations between us.
Yeah.
And they won't know about the bruises that I left on your arm, twisting it behind your back to make you change things.
I just want to say too, I my book in fact has a lot of mystery plot lines, and AP helped me pare it down. I think wisely. I think wisely, actually. I will say this. He was like, I think there are too many, and this is like very generalized. And it was like, some of these you can reveal, and it will add to the tension and help motivate the characters. And I think that was correct. But hilariously, this isn't just the Rings of Power. This isn't just mystery box JJ Abrams stuff. Like, even if you're getting him to edit you, he will be like, these mysteries, I think there's too many. Enough.
Well, but I did say that you keep some of them.
No, it's true. Some survived the colon. But he came. He had his pitchfork, and he was ready. He was, yeah.
But and ultimately, I mean, I think this is one of the fundamental differences between the writing of a novel and a TV show. The ultimate decision was still yours. It's still your artistic vision, your singular vision about what you're doing. And you don't have to follow what I say. You don't have a studio breathing down your neck. You don't have your characters going, well, actually, I don't think that that's true to my character. I want different lines.
Right. Yeah.
You don't have, well, it's going to be too expensive to do. This is a new setting. Can you not just reuse one of the other sets that we already have? You have so much control to bring it to life the way that you see it. And as soon as you move into a different medium, there are completely different constraints.
Yeah. And I mean, I think, again, kind of the fundamental thing here is like, try to have compassion, to get back to everyone's favorite Malazan theme. Uh, just like consider thinking that like these people, the vast majority of them are just trying their best and are like just trying to make it work. No one wants to make a bad thing. Like very few people, there are egos, and certainly I'm sure there are writers out there who like read the source material and were like, this is crap, I'm going to do my own thing. But the majority of the time, that's not what's happening. And just like have a little compassion with them, and even like as widely hated as like the last couple seasons of Game of Thrones, for example, were, and I'm one of the haters. I don't think it was good. Um, the showrunners, Dan and Dave, they're still guys. I know people who have met them and have said they're just like they're super nice and they're like very friendly and supportive to young and up and coming writers and things like that. And just like you don't have to assassinate someone's character in critiquing someone's work,
But
and that's
also,
something you get to in a lot with like books and stuff too, is like separating, an author's intention and their character and who they are as a person versus like the actually, what's on the page. And it's true with film and TV as well.
but even with like Game of Thrones, the first few seasons were adaptations of a written complete text.
Right.
And then when you run out of that material, it's like, okay, what do? We have to wrap things up. This is the end of the line. We're going to wrap things up. And you looked at that sprawling story that had developed and went, how can we wrap this up in the time that we have? And I don't think they were ever going to be able to do it in a way that is going to end up with whatever Martin had envisaged.
Right.
But they had to try and wrap things up. They couldn't base it off the books anymore. But even with Game of Thrones, which, as premier TV, that is so well regarded, the earlier seasons, massive changes to the books.
Massive. Yeah.
And, oh, yeah, but it was done with love. Whereas changes we don't like, oh, well, that's done with bad
Ego
intent.
and hatred. Yeah. Yeah.
No, the only difference is we liked that change or we forgave that change because it worked, even if it wasn't something we wanted. And these ones, oh, well, I don't like that change and I don't like how they did that. Yeah, that has to do with how we have to do with every adaptation, the things that we like. But that's not to do with, oh, well, they deliberately made that change because they didn't like the material. Which that rationale has never made any sense to me.
It's just often given in bad faith. I think it is just fundamentally, and again, I get it because like to some degree, these stories are important to people, and maybe they read them when they were young and they shaped them. But like again, just the internet has ruined everything. That's my thesis. The internet's ruined everything. No, nothing has any nuance anymore. We're all just screaming into the void at each other, and the internet is bad. Um,
and because things are usually couched in general terms and vague terms that have multiple ways that we can what is fidelity? Is it fidelity to plot? Is it fidelity to character? Is it fidelity to theme? Is it fidelity to tone? There are so many different ways of expressing fidelity to a story.
Absolutely.
And we've become very, very narrow in our definitions, particularly, I think, in fantasy, because I think a lot of readers, particularly of modern fantasy, the plot elements are the things that they see as fundamental. This is the main story. And yet we all know that books are far more complex than the narrative events that are made that make them up. It's
Absolutely.
the exploration of them. And different artists, different writers are going to express that in different ways. Different media will explore it in different ways. It doesn't mean that you have to like the changes. It doesn't mean you have to enjoy what these people are doing. And you can criticize them. But I think criticizing their intention is wrong. Overlooking what studios do to interfere can also lead us down a bad thing. Blaming everything on a studio when we can look at other products that studio has also made, you go, well, those things are all fine. So, but it's different people in different departments and different approaches. And if we say that modern TV is bad, go back and look at some of the earlier stuff to go, really? What was earlier TV doing? And if your examples are Game of Thrones and Peter Jackson's Lord of the Rings, they were both exceptional.
Yeah.
Go and look at the rest, because that, I think, is what we miss.
Absolutely. Yeah, we tend to, that I think it's the same thing when people generally talk about like films and stuff. They'll be like, oh, I mean, the way films have been made has changed over time, and certainly there's a lot more corporate interference than there was in like the 70s, for example. But like people will be like, oh, if the films were so good back then, it's because you like don't remember all the bad movies because they get forgotten with time, you know. And even we're talking about like fidelity to the adaptation. Lord of the Rings, those I mean, as you mentioned, Christopher Tolkien hated them. He thought they bastardized, his father's books. Like there were wild changes made, way more than honestly, like even like the first season of Game of Thrones, which I think is the closest adaptation of any books I've seen, maybe. And it certainly changes more from beyond, but like the Lord of the Rings movies, huge swings. They take huge swings. And people love them now. I love them. I watched them before I read the books. I confess, not The Hobbit. I read The Hobbit first, but I think people just let nostalgia definitely blind them to some of the experiences of the past. And certainly, I mean, people apparently hated the Arwen thing. They came out in droves. That was like the old, Galadriel's and Mary Sue of, back in the heyday of certain voices, coming out to express their strongly held beliefs.
Well, and on that slightly controversial note, Carl.
Yeah, please come for me with your pitchforks. I'm ready. Ready.
Thank you so much for having this conversation with me. I really appreciate it. Thank you
thank you for having me on.
And for those of you still watching, thank you very much for watching. Thank you for your continued support, and I will see you in the next one.